Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move second reading of Bill 221, an act respecting identification for veterans.
Ms. Skelly has moved second reading of Bill 221, an act respecting identification for veterans. Back to Ms. Skelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in the House this afternoon to introduce the Exalting Our Veterans Act 2020. Mr. Speaker, this is an act that will allow an individual to request that they be identified as a veteran on his or her driver's license or Ontario photo card. Recognition of their service on an official Ontario government identification card is merited. The freedom we enjoy in Canada today was hard-fought on battlefields over centuries. Our proud veterans have protected and preserved the freedom that we hold so dear today. And as Remembrance Day approaches, it's even more important to acknowledge the incredible sacrifices made by those who served our country and defended our values. On Remembrance Day, we recognize the courage and sacrifice of those who willingly went to war. During times of war, individual acts of heroism occur frequently. Only a few are ever recorded and receive official recognition. And that is why acknowledgement of veteran service, period, is so vitally important. The acknowledgement of service on an official Government of Ontario identification is for veterans who have served in the Canadian Forces, including the Reserve Forces and the forces of the Commonwealth or its wartime allies. They have served in the Merchant Navy or Ferry Command during wartime. They have served in NATO operations or as members of the United Nations Peacekeeping Force. This official recognition of service on a driver's license is done in other provinces and jurisdictions. It's not only a piece of identification that signifies our appreciation for their service, but it readily identifies veterans to businesses that may be offering a discount to those who have served our country. Glenn Gibson, Honorary Colonel of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada, heartily endorses the initiative to offer Ontario government identification that signifies the holder has served in the Canadian military. Military personnel are eligible to receive discounts involving dozens of brands of goods and services, everything from retail to restaurants to vacation destinations. Gibson says individuals don't get rich serving in the military, and they don't necessarily collect a robust pension. Any initiative that would make it easier to receive a discount would be greatly appreciated. Now, let me tell you some of the personal stories of people in my family who have made sacrifices in service to our country over generations. My grandfather, Henry Skelly, served in World War I. I still have and very much cherish his World War I diary. Papa Skelly, as we called him, enlisted in the armed services in North Bay in 1916 at the age of 35. He was a member of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in the 4th Canadian Railway Troops, 159th Regiment. He trained in England, and he served in France, in Belgium, and in Holland. My grandfather, Papa, suffered injury from exposure to mustard gas and shrapnel wounds to his leg. Papa was born in 1881. He died in 1969 at the age of 88. Wow. Because of my grandfather's service, Remembrance Day is especially meaningful to me. During the First World War, the Canadian Expeditionary Force acquired an enviable reputation among the Allied armies because it did not lose a single battle during the last 2 years of the war. The Canadian divisions paid a heavy price in terms of human lives lost on the plains of Flanders. 1/4 of the 60,000 Canadian dead in the First World War fell on Belgian soil. As a young reporter, I worked in Pembroke and in Kingston. I spent numerous hours and days at CFB Petawawa, CFB Trenton, and RMC Kingston, speaking to military personnel about their experiences in conflicts around the world. In 1991, I traveled to Doha, Qatar, where I reported from the Canadian bases called Canada Dry 1 and Canada Dry 2, where CF-18s were stationed during Operation Desert Storm. I have a deep, deep respect for the men and women in our armed forces who are willing to risk their lives so that we, as legislators, regardless of political stripe, can stand in this House and debate the issues we believe in. We often take for granted our Canadian values and institutions, our freedom to participate in cultural and political events, our right to live under a government of our choice. But Canadians who step up to defend our values truly believe that without freedom, there can be no ensuring peace, and without peace, no enduring freedom. We live in the greatest country in the world. It is the greatest country in the world, in part because of the sacrifices of the members of our military and our veterans. We should all take the time to appreciate the great life that we enjoy in Canada. This wonderful freedom is enshrined in our Constitution and is preserved by the rule of law. But freedom is not free. It never has been. It was won on battlefields over the centuries. Freedom is being preserved by our soldiers today. Unfortunately, there are people in this country who seek to attack and undermine our freedoms. 6 years ago, last month, Hamilton's Corporal Nathan Cirillo was gunned down while standing guard on ceremonial sentry duty at the Canadian National War Memorial in Ottawa. The attacker was a terrorist sympathizer who expressed his desire to kill some soldiers. Nathan Cirillo, a member of Hamilton's Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, was only 24 years old. He left behind a young son. Nathan Cirillo was also a dog lover. He had 3 dogs of his own. A leash-free dog park in Hamilton was named in honor of the fallen reservist. I often take my dog, Louie, to that park, and each time I pass the plaque that has been hung in his honor in that park, it brings back memories of the horror we all felt the day he was murdered. Corporal Nathan Cirillo's death shocked our nation. People questioned how a Canadian soldier standing guard at a war memorial could be ambushed by a person with terrorist leanings on Canadian soil. We remember the service and sacrifice of Corporal Nathan Cirillo and the tens of thousands of other soldiers and military personnel who lost their lives defending our freedoms. These are courageous men and women in uniform who often risk their own lives to defend our values and freedoms here at home and around the world. Many of them bear the scars of war, scars that may not be readily obvious in soldiers and veterans who are suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. These are members of our family, our friends, our neighbors, and our co-workers. We lost 158 Canadians in Afghanistan. Our soldiers and veterans who served in Afghanistan laid the groundwork for changes that significantly improved the lives of people in that country. For example, because of the efforts of Canadian soldiers, girls are now able to get an education. These soldiers risked losing their limbs and their lives in battlefields littered with landmines to fight for the freedoms that people in Afghanistan now enjoy. Our soldiers have changed conditions and bettered the lives of people in many other countries as well over the past decades. During World War I, World War II, in Korea, Bosnia, Canadian soldiers continue the responsibility of peacekeeping in hotspots around the world. We owe a debt of gratitude to those who have served our nation. This single, simple notation on their driver's license identifying them as a veteran is simply additional recognition for their service. This initiative has received wholehearted support from the Royal Canadian Legion branches in my riding of Flamborough-Glanbrook. In fact, The Royal Canadian Legion is the organization that will verify an individual's status as a veteran. Jordy Elms is the president of the Ontario branch of Last Post Fund. He is a retired Canadian Armed Forces colonel who has had a long and distinguished military career. Jordy supports this bill, allowing veterans to be identified on their driver's license or photo ID card. He says, in addition to it being a nice gesture of recognition, it serves a much more practical purpose. Many veterans suffer with mental health issues, and many of them are homeless. A government-issued ID carried by every veteran in Ontario would go a long way toward assisting veterans facing a mental health crisis. Medical personnel would be able to immediately access the federal health supports available for every veteran. Colonel Elms said this identification would be an all-encompassing gesture of recognition that says more than just thank you for your service. Such a piece of identification could have the effect of making a positive difference in a veteran's life. The easiest way to identify a veteran is through a piece of ID that everyone carries, and that usually is a driver's license or photo ID card. Many veterans carry identification issued by the Royal Canadian Legion or other organizations, but that identification doesn't necessarily have a photo on it. For a veteran's identification to be valid, it should be a photo ID. Presenting a photo ID would go a long way toward preventing fraud. Mr. Speaker, the bill being presented today is intended to show additional respect to our military personnel. It's another opportunity to recognize our military personnel. They have risked their lives to protect our freedoms. Last year, I met with a number of veterans at the Remembrance Day ceremony at Hamilton's Warplane Heritage Museum. They were adorned with medals and pins honoring them for their bravery. But being able to have that status acknowledged permanently on personal identification is another opportunity to give veterans the recognition they deserve. Mr. Speaker, with this simple designation, we can show veterans that we value them and their service to our country. Thank you.
Thank you.